luckily, many of the people who rail against censorship, who are not happy about it, they're actually the brightest people around. They're the clearest thinkers. And among them was this whoever was Satoshi Nakamoto, and then of course Vitalik Buterin and people like Zuko and so on. And they have started building the infrastructure to create a censorship resistant internet. And it starts out with money, because if you can create censorship resistant money, and money is the most important, let's put it, money is the largest bounty item in the world. Money, to most people, money is the most important thing, and they'll do anything to get it. And so therefore, if you can create a money that cannot be stolen or cannot be hacked or cannot be stopped, if you can create unstoppable money, then you can create unstoppable anything. And so Bitcoin is the experiment to create unstoppable money. And then from that comes Ethereum, which is the experiment to create unstoppable applications, starting with financial applications, because those are the only ones that are valuable enough to kind of take on the load of a creaky, new, expensive technology like blockchains. But then over time, you're seeing other things are going to start emerging: gaming networks, social networks, and now you're seeing with NFTs, these title registries for art and music and all kinds of representations of physical assets into digital assets. So we're basically seeing blockchains, I believe, are going to wholesale replace gigantic chunks of the internet. Until 20 years from now, it's going to be unfathomable to run an internet without blockchains. Unfathomable. You will not be able to do it. It will be like going back from smartphones to flip phones to those old bricks or the landlines. It'll be ludicrously stupid. And what will be really interesting to me is, first, of course, the transformation of the internet into a true free domain. But then secondly will be how totalitarian societies react to this. So someone like China, who's built the Great Firewall this entire time, they think the threat from Bitcoin is it's a digital currency. So they're creating the Chinese digital currency. That's not the threat. The threat is
No.
that the internet itself becomes an uncensorable free market of encrypted information and data and communications. And if you don't adopt that one, then you're living in an older, broken version of the internet. And maybe somehow they'll be able to force their poor population that has no choice to go along with it, but they're not going to be able to control the rest of the world that way. Certainly, any society that I think has a blockchain-enabled internet will be decades ahead of one that doesn't.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see what our ruling class does about that. I don't know if ruling class is the right word, but these people that we've been
Yeah, they're
talking
right.
about,
The elite
what
class.
are they going to
That's
do
right.
about that?
No, I mean, they're not going to be happy about it. But at the same time, one of the huge trends with the internet is destroying institutions and replacing them with individuals. And it's doing
Yeah.
that by exposing the illegitimacy and how unnecessary all these gatekeepers were. Like, look at all the journalists who are lobbying for Twitter and Clubhouse to censor because they want to be the censors, right? Look at all the academics who will rail against, crypto because they want to be the ones who are allocating where resources go in modern society. Look at how Wall Street's going to react to crypto, right? So you're going to have huge pushback. But at the same time, I think the crypto revolution is really interesting because it's individuals first, right? Individuals front ran institutions. To this day, there are more individuals who are into it than institutions. Individuals are getting these incredible yields in decentralized finance. Individuals are the ones who are front running Bitcoin before the big institutions come in later this year. And of course, it's a crazy Wild West. I'm not recommending anyone who isn't willing to truly understand at a technical and financial level to get into it. But the reason why fortunes are being made in crypto is because it is true Wild West. It's unoccupied territory. It's new land. So people are going out there and staking the new land. But it's just as dangerous and just as crazy and just as scammy as the Wild West. And institutions don't know how to function in these environments because institutions move through consensus. And only an individual can really seek the truth. And a group has to have consensus. If it doesn't have consensus, it falls apart. It's no longer a group. So a group is what forms after you've figured out how to solve a problem. So you set out to solve a problem. Usually it's an individual or two or three who solve the problem, and then they form a group to implement the solution. But groups themselves do not solve problems. And so these groups can
Cannot.
keep institutions alive, cannot go and create new things. And so they are going to, it's just a question of when, it's not a question of if. They're going to get overrun by the internet, and we're going to have much more fluid institutions that are formed on demand as needed, but will be based on the individuals and based on merit. So, for example, what are you and I doing here? In a pre-internet era, we would have never never
You try
greenlit
convincing an
this.
A&R person or a record label that this is a good idea.
Yeah. Exactly. But you have it's so I get invited
Songs
by
about
journalists
leverage.
on their yeah, I get invited by journalists on their podcasts, or they want to interview me, or they want to write about me in the newspaper, or they want me on their radio show. Like, why do I need an intermediary? We don't need any more intermediaries. We can all go direct. Why do you need a PR firm? Why do you need? What is a journalist? A journalist is just someone with a Twitter following. In fact, it's funny to watch a bunch of journalists now railing against Substack and talking about how Substack is evil. Substack is just choice. It's the choice to go out on your own. And what's incredible to me is like all the good journalists are leaving for Substack. If you can't run your own Substack, that means that you're one of the journalists who was being subsidized in the past by the journalists who can run their own Substack. And so what you're going to see is all the good journalists are going to go onto Substack, all the bad ones are going to be left behind. And what we're seeing is a squandering of these incredible brands like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Journal, and all these brands. These brands were built up over hundreds of years, and now we're going to spend them hard in the next few years and maybe the next decade, where the normal person who can't be bothered, isn't paying attention, might be like, oh yeah, New York Times, and continues to believe it. But I think that the next generation will consider these brands to be utterly useless and will instead just subscribe to whichever journalist or whichever person that they feel best
It's
represents a
people,
filter
yeah.
of reality for them. Exactly, it's people.
I'm sure you see this with your children. I have an 8-year-old, and he doesn't have any kind of loyalty or affinity to any corporation or body or magazine or anything. He has individuals, and when those individuals become untrustworthy or he falls out of line with them for whatever reason, he finds another one,
Yeah,
and that's that.
yeah. That's also a reason why people have a hard time wrapping their head around NFTs, because that is loyalty to individual artists, right? It's not like,
Yeah.
oh, the institutions say that Leonardo da Vinci is a good artist, or the gallery says it's the new hot modern art person. No, the individuals are basically deciding for themselves and forming a micro community around the artist, and it's up to the artist to be full stack, to engage, to market, to serve, and to help, and to create. But now these direct relationships don't require any intermediation. They don't require any institutions in the way. Now, the bad news is that how are these individuals connecting with each other? Well, they're connecting with each other through these massive platforms. So instead of having 20 gatekeepers, 20 old world offline gatekeepers, we have one online gatekeeper. But even there, I
Exactly.
think, but even and those gatekeepers themselves have become very comfortable with the use of power. Like Andrew Chen just joined; he's on the board of Clubhouse and invested in it. So this is a good time to smash Clubhouse, right? Which is Clubhouse is the latest example of these kinds of gatekeepers, which is great. It enables us in so many levels. But one of the big problems I have with Clubhouse is that they're also engaging in moderation and censorship. And right now it's light-handed, but you can bet as they become more and more powerful, it'll become more and more heavy-handed. Which is why I look forward to trying other platforms if Clubhouse even continues down the moderation and censorship path. Moderation is just a nice way of saying we just block whatever we don't like. And you can see how it got really out of control on Twitter and Facebook in the last few years when the masks came off. And so I just think that any ability to censor is the problem. Ultimately, like Google used to say, "Don't be evil," and they took that away because it's just too tempting. Even if the founders believe that, the founders eventually don't end up running the company.
Well, it's
And
like you were talking about earlier. You have a couple of people, some individuals will create something, and then in will come a big group, and then the group will start making these big group sort of decisions and move in that fashion, and the thing will usually be destroyed.
yeah, the group will operate through consensus. The consensus will be set by the most intolerant minority. So you'll
Yep.
have an intolerant minority within the group who will control the group and then use it to consensus and groupthink. But it also sows the seeds of its own destruction down the line, because then they get fat and happy and they're like, great, now we're all set. We run the world. But you've lost all the creators. You've lost all the innovators. The one brilliant engineer who could think for themselves kind of slinked out the back door because they want to have nothing to do with this. And then they're going to go create the next crypto-based Clubhouse or the next crypto-based Twitter that is going to eventually just steamroll the existing social networks.
Yeah, even in a situation, because I think about this stuff, and you go, like, say the way Disney operates these days. You're like, why are they doing these things when it's definitely not making them money and it's definitely losing them money? And you go, well, there's no competition. They have no real impetus to have to operate in that fashion anymore. But as you were saying, once you get to the point where like literally no one of any worth at all will work there when no one's paying attention to the thing. And meanwhile, someone's set up shop next door and they've built this new way of communicating and this new way of telling stories that's impervious.
Yeah, someone like Disney is relying upon brand and distribution, and that's getting weaker and weaker by the day because distribution is no longer through their movie theaters and their shelf space. It's through Netflix and it's through any old website. So
anyone can stream to a TV now.
Exactly.
Is Clubhouse? Can you stream Clubhouse to a TV? Of course you can. So we are now competing with Disney Plus right now.
Exactly. And at least we're competing for the time and the attention. But the modern platforms rely on a much more insidious thing, which is they rely upon network effects. And network effects in an olden day, used to form slowly over time. And people realized like, okay, it only makes sense to run one fiber cable, into the neighborhood because the moment a competitor shows up, the incumbent can just drop prices because they have a sunk cost. They can provide it for free, drive the competitor out of business and go back to raising prices. So these monopolists naturally form as utilities in power and electricity and telephone. And so we have to regulate them as such. So they have to become common carriers. And utilities are common carriers and they're forced to carry all content because it's too much power to leave up to a private corporation. In fact, in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash book, the guy who kind of takes over the world, it's a futuristic book, a really good sci-fi thriller. The guy who takes over the world is actually the billionaire or the multi-billionaire who basically lays all the fiber cable to everybody's homes. He's unregulated, so he controls all the information going into your home. And in that book, he's a Christian fanatic, but it turns out to be the exact opposite, right? It turns out that the cable layers are regulated as common carriers, but now you have these social networks built on top that are not regulated as utilities or as common carriers because they move too fast and it happened too quickly and people didn't realize that they'd seized the means of information dissemination. And so now they've taken over the cables, and the multi-billionaires who run this are the Zucks and the Jacks of the world, and maybe Paul Davison eventually, and nobody gets to tell them what to do. It's unfortunate, but we found ourselves in a different dystopian hell than the one he laid out. But it's actually similar. It's virtual cables rather than physical cables.
Yes, and here we are. But how long can that last realistically?
I mean, it can last for a while. Unfortunately, I don't think these things happen that quickly. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. The network effects are incredibly powerful. It's very, very hard to switch, right? In that sense, like the strongest network effect is probably in Twitter and Facebook, where you have these tight social graphs. Twitter is probably the strongest because it's a cross person social lab, right? It's a social graph. It's cross friendship. So in Facebook, it's just your friend circle. So in theory, the people that are the most important to you on Facebook, you know them in real life. So you could move to another place and take them with you. In Twitter, you don't even know who the heck your followers are. You have no idea. And you have no way to find them in the future if you were to move. It's not like Twitter's giving you their email address. When they cancel you, they intend to punish you. If Twitter didn't want to punish you, they would export their graph and maybe you have an email address or a newsletter or something where people could subscribe to you and follow you another way. But Twitter intends to punish you. They're vindictive. And so you unfortunately the social graph portability doesn't exist. And so you get locked into these social networks. And Twitter has probably the most powerful network effect. I think Clubhouse is a little bit weaker. Especially, there's two kinds of Clubhouse. Clubhouse is actually multiple apps running in one or multiple networks. And one of those is we're here to socialize like a cocktail party. And that has a very powerful network effect because that's just based on, critical mass and demographics and so on. So once people are in one network, you just want to go where the best cocktail party is. You want to go where the best conversations are. So you just show up to that one. But there's a different effect on Clubhouse, which is you're going there to listen to a specific person that you're really interested in. And so you're coming there to listen to me or to you. And so when we tweet out, people show up based on where we are. So if I did this talk on Twitter Spaces, I expect to probably have just as many people, right? They just have to download an app and they're interested in listening to me and there they are. So Clubhouse doesn't really have a lock on people like us. Who are kind of the larger creators with their own independent followings. Unfortunately, where our hands are tied are on Twitter because Twitter is where we spread the information. So in that sense, Twitter is kind of the crown jewel of the social networks because it has the most unreplicatable one-way follow graph that can be used as a broadcast media to alert people to anything else. So the fact that Twitter has become so censorious and so kind of controlled by whatever they call their internal trust and safety team is awful. It's really bad. But I hope that some blockchain-based alternatives will be emerging. There are already one or two out there, and there's going to be a bunch more.
Yeah.
And one of the things that blockchains are really good at is solving the critical mass problem, at breaking network effects. This to me is the David versus Goliath fight of the 21st century, which is, can a blockchain-based social network, using the power of incentives and open programmability and permission. So there's four things a blockchain-based social network brings to the fight that are unique, right? If you look on one hand, there's Goliath, which is a Twitter or a Facebook, where they seem like they have unlimited resources, they have massive network effect, huge amounts of content. How are you ever going to get people off of it? But if you flip the other side, what David has four little weapons. David has payments built in. Which are so you can build in money, and money is a very powerful incentive. We see how tokens and blockchains are kind of drive people nuts almost, especially, and early adopters get rewarded. So now you have a social network where the early adopters, if they're right, if they pick the winning social network of the future correctly, they become millionaires, right?
Well,
and that's a very
trick,
powerful incentive for. Yeah, that is a huge trick. So payments are a big deal. The second piece is permanence. You can't get canceled. So now you can rest at least a lot more assured that every follower you collect will be your follower forever, right? That's to the extent that you keep them interested, engaged, of course, but you're not going to lose them. A third one is you get permissionless programmability, and don't underestimate this at all. This isn't just APIs. This is completely open source. Because the data is protected inside the blockchain through private keys by each user, the network itself can be completely open. The source code can be out there. So people can take these blockchain-based social networks and start doing remixes on them. And that's why you and I are here, because you remix my content. But now these are coders, engineers, designers remixing each other's content, and they're going to create incredible clients. And then finally, there's peer governance, which is to the extent that there is any governance in these networks, which will be, I think, much lower than there is in something like Twitter, it'll be done at a peer level. So, for example, today on Twitter, there's only one editor, right? Think of Twitter as like a giant newspaper where there are lots and lots of writers and there's lots and lots of readers, but there's only one editor, and that editor is Twitter, right? So that editor is a very heavy-handed boss, usually most of the times ignoring everything, can't do anything, and then once in a blue moon will swoop down and just smash somebody. Whereas if you look at a blockchain-based social network, they will have a distributed hierarchy of editors. You can literally choose which editor that you want to follow, and based on their mutant block lists and the mutant block lists of the people that they subscribe to, you will get your own customized Twitter. So I think these four different pieces, peer governance, permissionless programmability, payments, and permanence, are what are going to be the real weapons that blockchain-based social networks bring to the fight. And I think it'll be really interesting, because just as Bitcoin is showing that if you can create unstoppable money, then you can create unstoppable anything digital. The same way, I think that the blockchain-based social networks will show if you can break Twitter's network effect, then you can break any digital network effect.